The night Lena Hart was told she owned an island, the temperature on the Beaufort waterfront had dropped to 38 degrees, the wind was slicing in off the Atlantic, and her son was asleep on a plastic chair with his cheek pressed against her coat because they no longer had a place to go. The probate office had already closed. The receptionist had shut off half the lights. The hallway smelled like damp paper, floor polish, and rain dragged in on cheap shoes. Lena sat there with one grocery bag, a backpack, and $14.62 folded inside an empty cough drop tin. Her son, Noah, was 9 years old, too thin for his age, and sleeping the way tired children sleep when they've learned not to ask too many questions. Across the hall, her Uncle Vernon was still laughing. "An island," he said for the third time, loud enough for the entire corridor to hear. That old man left the homeless girl an island. The lawyer had used more formal language than that. Gray Glass Island. 7.4 acres. One derelict cottage. One ruined dock. Accrued county taxes. Appurtenant riparian rights. A brass key sealed in an envelope. A handwritten note from her grandfather in ink that had faded to brown. For the child who still watches the tide. That was all. No bank account. No trust fund. No apology from the family who had stopped visiting him years ago. Just an island everyone in the room called worthless. But when the lawyer slid that key across the table, Vernon's face had changed for half a second. Not amusement. Not pity. Recognition. Lena had seen it, even through the fog of hunger and exhaustion and the humiliating heat rising in her face while her aunt murmured, "Cruel thing to do to a woman with a child." A worthless island. A rusted key. And a look on the wrong man's face that said something about this did not add up. She didn't know it yet. But that tiny flicker would be the difference between staying broken and learning that some things people call ruined are only buried. Outside, the rain struck the courthouse steps in silver needles. Noah stirred, coughed once, and whispered, "Mom? I'm here. Are we going to the shelter?" She looked through the glass doors at the black river beyond the streetlights and felt the weight of the envelope in her pocket. The shelter had given them 30 nights. They had used 29. Tomorrow morning, if she couldn't prove a new address, they would lose the cot too. Her uncle came down the hall buttoning his coat, expensive wool, dry under the awning, smelling faintly of tobacco and money. "Lena," he said, soft now, like softness itself was a trick. "You don't want that property. Taxes alone will bury you. Sign it over tomorrow and I'll give you 5,000 cash. Enough for a motel and a fresh start." She looked at him. "If it's worthless, why do you care?" For one beat, the old building went silent except for the rain. Then Vernon smiled. "That's exactly why you'll never keep it." He walked away. And in her pocket, the brass key felt heavier than metal should. Get ready. Because the piece of land everybody mocked was the one thing the wrong people wanted most. If you've ever felt betrayed when you were already struggling, if you've ever been treated like your pain made you easy to erase, if you've ever been forced to start over with nothing but a child looking up at you, then stay with the story, because sometimes the world throws people away too early, and sometimes what looks like the end is only the place where the tide turns. 2 years earlier, Lena Hart still believed hard work could outlast bad luck. She lived in a rented duplex on Trad Street Extension, a narrow beige place with a crooked mailbox, mildew in the bathroom corners, and a monthly rent of $925 that felt high but survivable. She worked breakfast shifts at the Harbor House Diner 6 days a week and cleaned 3 vacation rentals on Thursdays for extra cash. She knew how to stretch ground beef across 2 dinners, how to turn stale bread into garlic toast, how to smile at rude men in golf shirts because tips still paid the light bill. Her husband, Caleb, had once been the kind of man who made promises with both hands. He talked fast, hugged hard, dreamed bigger than their bank account, and could make Noah laugh until milk came out of his nose. For a while, that felt like enough. Then the promises started breaking in small places first. A missed utility payment. A bounced check. A lie about overtime that turned into a lie about gambling and then into a silence that smelled like beer and panic. Lena covered what she could. She sold her grandmother's silver bracelet for $140. She picked up double shifts. She ate after Noah ate and sometimes not at all. Caleb kept saying he had one big job lined up, one lucky break, one friend who owed him money. But luck never came. The calls did. The landlord. The credit card company. The urgent care clinic after Noah's winter pneumonia and 3 nights of wheezing so bad Lena thought his ribs might split apart. In February, the medical bill arrived folded in a white envelope that felt heavier than a brick. $2,811 after insurance. She sat on the bed holding it while the heater clicked and failed and clicked again. Caleb said, "We'll figure it out." He didn't. He left in April. No note on the kitchen table. No dramatic confession. Just a missing duffel bag, 2 empty drawers, and the kind of silence that tells the truth before anybody else does. His phone went to voicemail by noon. By evening, Lena had learned he was in Savannah with a woman who managed a bait shop and had no child, no debt, and no patience for reality. That was betrayal. But betrayal was only the first wave. The rent went up to $1,180 in June because the owner said, market conditions. The diner cut weekday hours when tourist season slowed. Noah outgrew his shoes. The car needed a transmission she could not afford. Then it was towed from the grocery lot after she was 6 days late on insurance. Every piece of stability left one at a time, like boards coming loose in a storm. Through all of it, there was only one person in the family who still answered Lena's calls. Her grandfather, Arthur Hart. Everybody else called him stubborn. Proud to the point of foolishness. He had spent 40 years working water, first as a deckhand, then a harbor pilot, then a marine survey assistant who knew channels and mudflats better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. After Lena's grandmother died, Arthur had turned inward. He stopped attending church. Stopped coming to holidays. Kept to himself in the old White House near Battery Creek with a wall of tide charts, a cabinet full of tools, and a coffee mug always stained dark at the bottom. The family said he was impossible. Lena knew something else. When she was 11 and her mother forgot to pick her up from school, Arthur came instead, smelling of salt and diesel and cedar shavings. When she was 15 and crying because girls with smoother hair and cleaner shoes had laughed at her thrift store dress, Arthur bought her a hot dog from a roadside stand and said, "Don't measure your life with the wrong ruler." When she was 21 and holding newborn Noah in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and fear, Arthur stood in the corner with tears in his eyes and whispered, "Now there's a reason to keep going." He did not say much. But what he said stayed. He also said something else, years before the will, years before the island became the last thing standing between ruin and a future. What the tide takes, it sometimes returns. At the time, Lena thought he was talking about grief. Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. Arthur had owned Grey Glass Island longer than Lena had been alive. Family legend said he'd won it in a card game, which was nonsense. The truth was less glamorous and more like him. In 1978, after a storm changed the inlet channels, a widow in Charleston could no longer afford maintenance on the island's caretaker cottage or dock. Arthur had helped survey storm damage in the marsh. He bought the property cheap, not because it was profitable, but because he said nobody should own a place and let it die from neglect. For years he took a skiff over there alone. No family picnics. No fishing parties. No social media sunsets. Just Arthur, a tackle box, a battered thermos, and sometimes a spool of survey string. If anyone asked why he bothered, he'd shrug and say, "Some places don't need crowds. They need memory." Vernon, his oldest son, hated that answer. Vernon believed land existed to be leveraged, divided, sold, refinanced, and stripped clean. He wore polished loafers to family gatherings and referred to marsh as wasted frontage. He had failed at 2 real estate ventures and blamed regulations, weather, and weak partners in exactly that order. When Lena's mother died, Vernon promised to look out for her. What he meant was he'd call twice a year, ask if she needed anything, and then remind her how much he'd done already. When Arthur's health started slipping, Vernon suddenly became interested again. He brought forms. He brought opinions. He brought men in pressed shirts who stood in Arthur's yard pointing at lines on plats and talking about access, marina potential, mitigation credits, and future value once the county updates the flood maps. Arthur put them all off the property. Only Lena kept coming with groceries, prescriptions, clean towels, and time. She would stop after work with Noah asleep in the back seat, carry in canned soup, refill Arthur's pill organizer, and open windows when the house smelled too closed in. She paid his electric bill twice without telling him because the notices were read and folded under a magnet on the fridge. When arthritis made his hands shake, she trimmed his hedges and changed a leaking kitchen faucet while he sat at the table pretending not to watch. He never thanked her in long speeches. He would just slide a plate across the table, fried mullet or tomato sandwiches, and say, "Eat before you get stupid." Noah loved him instantly. Arthur taught him how to read weather from cloud edges, how to tell mud crabs from fiddlers, how to stand still enough to watch egrets hunt. He would tap maps with one thick finger and ask, "Where's north?" Noah always knew. And once, on a wet afternoon in September, when thunder was walking far off over the water, Arthur had pulled a brass key from his pocket, shown it to Noah for one strange second, then tucked it away again. "What's that for?" Noah asked. Arthur's mouth tightened in the way it always did when a memory passed through him. "For the right day," he said. Lena laughed. "You sound like a pirate." Arthur did not laugh back. "Pirates took things," he said. "I'm trying to keep something." That should have sounded dramatic. In his voice, it sounded tired. Lena never asked again. Then the hospital came. A minor stroke first. Another fall. A chest infection. The old White House became too much, and Arthur hated every hour of the assisted living center where the hallways were always overcooled and the television in the common room never shut up. Vernon came twice in 6 months, each visit with paperwork. Lena came every Tuesday and Friday, even when it meant taking the bus because the car was gone, even when she was so tired her knees ached on the walk back. The last clear conversation she had with Arthur happened 3 weeks before he died. He was thinner. The skin on his hands looked almost translucent. Rain tapped the window. Noah was coloring at the foot of the bed. Arthur watched him for a long time and then said, "They'll tell you certain things are useless." Lena smiled gently. "You mean men?" One corner of his mouth moved. "I mean whatever they can't control." He looked back at Noah. "Remember this, both of you. People bury seeds every day and call it throwing things away." Lena frowned. "Granddad, what are you talking about?" But a coughing spell took him then, and when it passed, he closed his eyes like the effort of staying in the world had become expensive. She didn't know it yet, but those words would return to her on the worst night of her life like a lantern in the dark. Arthur died at 4:12 a.m. on a Tuesday. The nurse called while Lena was stripping beds at a rental condo with ocean-themed wallpaper peeling at the corners. She sat on the closed toilet lid and cried with a towel in her hands. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just the quiet crying of someone who understands that one more good thing has left and the day still expects them to keep moving. The funeral was small because Arthur had made it very clear he did not want fuss. Salt Marsh Church. 12 people. Weak coffee in the fellowship hall. Vernon cried harder than Lena believed and kept glancing around to see who noticed. 3 days later came the will reading. Lena almost didn't go. She had $2 and some change in gas money, and the borrowed ride from a diner coworker had a cracked windshield and no heat. But the shelter intake worker had told her any possible inheritance matters for housing assistance, so she went in her cleanest sweater and prayed Noah would stay quiet. The conference room had fake fern plants in the corners and a polished table with scratches hidden under lemon oil. Vernon sat at the head like he owned the place already. Beside him was his son Kyle, who wore mirrored sunglasses indoors and smelled like expensive cologne and impatience. Aunt Bonnie dabbed at her eyes with tissues and said, before the lawyer even opened the file, "I just hope Arthur did right by family." The lawyer, Ms. Delaney, was a silver-haired woman with narrow glasses and the calm of someone who had watched greed embarrass itself many times before. She began reading. Arthur's fishing tackle went to an old deckhand friend. His tools to a church repair ministry. A small donation to the county library. The mainland house, subject to outstanding debts and liens, to Vernon. Vernon sat back, satisfied. Then Ms. Delaney turned the page. To my granddaughter Lena Hart, and to my great-grandson Noah Hart, jointly, I leave Grey Glass Island, including the cottage, dock remains, and all appurtenant riparian and literal rights attached thereto, with all private papers and effects stored thereon. The room went still. Kyle was the first one to laugh. Aunt Bonnie actually blinked in confusion. The island? That wreck? Ms. Delaney continued. Included with this device is a sealed envelope to be given upon acceptance. She slid the envelope across the table. Lena did not reach for it right away. She could feel every eye on her, measuring, judging, deciding this was either a cruel joke or a fitting one. Homeless woman gets useless land. Family problem solved. Then Vernon spoke too fast. There must be some mistake. The island has negative value. Taxes, insurance, storm exposure. Arthur revised his will 8 months ago, Ms. Delaney said evenly. He was competent. It was witnessed and notarized. There is no mistake. How much are the taxes? Lena asked quietly. Ms. Delaney checked a document. $6,184.73, including penalties. The number hit like cold water. She had $14.62. Bonnie made a small pitying sound that somehow felt worse than Vernon's laugh. Kyle muttered, "Congratulations on your swamp." But it was Vernon's face Lena watched. For just 1 second before he covered it, there was anger there. Sharp, hot, unguarded anger. Not because Arthur had been unfair. Because Arthur had done something Vernon didn't expect. That was the moment Lena finally took the envelope. Inside was the key and the note. For the child who still watches the tide. Her hands shook. Noah, sitting beside her, whispered, "It's the same key." "What key?" Vernon snapped. Noah shrank back instantly. Lena put a hand on his shoulder. "Nothing." Ms. Delaney glanced up. "There is one more condition. Acceptance must be filed within 28 days. If Ms. Hart declines, the property may pass to residual handling. If she accepts, responsibility transfers with it." "That means she'll lose it inside a month," Kyle said. "Save us all some trouble." But then Vernon leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Lena, sign it to me. Today. I'll take over the taxes. I'll even give you something for it. 5,000. There it was again. "Too quick. Too eager." Lena said, "You just called it negative value." Vernon smiled without warmth. "I'm trying to be generous." "No," she said, and even she was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You're trying to buy something cheap." His jaw hardened. The rest of the meeting dissolved into legal words and resentful sighs, but the choice had already planted itself in Lena's mind. If the island was truly worthless, nobody would be pushing this hard. And if Arthur had left a key and a note to Noah, then whatever he'd meant to protect was not meant for Vernon. He thought he'd won. He hadn't. That evening, after the office emptied and the rain kept falling and the shelter lights waited on the other side of town, Lena opened the acceptance packet under a street lamp and signed her name. She became the owner of an island with no money, no transportation, $6,000 in back taxes, and nowhere to sleep. That's when everything changed. The shelter let them stay one extra night because the desk clerk, Mrs. Flores, had kind eyes and a grandson Noah's age. But at breakfast she slid a form across the table and said, almost apologetically, "If you have inherited property, technically that counts as housing potential." Lena stared at her. "It has no heat. I don't even know if the roof stands." Mrs. Flores sighed. "I know. I'm sorry." By noon they were out. They spent 3 hours at the public library because it was warm and free. Lena used the computer to pull up the county parcel map for Gray Glass Island. The screen showed a tiny shape in the inlet east of Battery Creek, just under 3 miles by water from the public landing. 7.4 acres. Flood zone. Improvements listed: cottage, dock. Assessed value: low enough to be insulting, high enough to matter. There was a satellite image too. Dense marsh grass. 3 twisted live oaks. A narrow strip of higher ground in the center. The roof of the cottage looked patched once, years ago, then left to bleach under salt and sun. From that altitude it seemed less like property and more like something the tide had forgotten to erase. Noah leaned close to the screen. "It looks lonely." "It does. Can we go there?" The honest answer was that Lena had no boat, no fuel money, no practical reason, and every reason to walk straight back to Vernon and take whatever cash he offered. Instead she said, maybe, because she could still see his face in that conference room. Because Arthur had never been sentimental with land. Because poor people do not get many chances to trust their instincts, but the rare times they do, it can save their lives. The boat came from Tomas Rivas, who ran a repair shed behind the bait shop and had once fixed a loose wheel on Lena's stroller for free when Noah was a baby. Tomas was thick-shouldered, middle-aged, permanently sun-browned, and skeptical in a way that felt protective instead of cruel. "You want to live on Grey Glass?" he asked, wiping grease from his hands. "That place has no electricity." "I know. Dock's half gone." "I know. Water?" "I don't know." Tomas studied her face and saw, as decent people do, the line between bad planning and desperation. He looked at Noah, then back at Lena. "I got an old skiff with a two-stroke that hates cold mornings. Not pretty, but it floats. You bring it back in one piece and cover the gas when you can." Lena almost cried right there in the gravel. Instead she said, "I will." He handed her a small red gas can and shook his head. Arthur used to come by for fuel every few weeks. Same island. Same look in his eye. Like he was checking on something. "What?" Tomas shrugged. "If I knew, I'd be charging you more." The crossing took 22 minutes in gray water under a sky so low it felt nailed down. Noah sat in an orange life vest that swallowed his neck and held the envelope in both hands like it mattered. Salt spray stung Lena's cheeks. The outboard motor coughed whenever she pushed it too hard. Marsh hens lifted from the reeds. The mainland receded into a smear of pilings, church steeples, and shrimp boat masts until the only sound was the chop of the hull and the thin winter wind. Then the island rose ahead of them. Not dramatic. Not tropical. Not the kind from postcards. Grey Glass was a blunt, wind-bent patch of earth rimmed by marsh and oyster shell, with one weathered cottage perched on the highest ground and a dock that looked like an old man missing teeth. The boards on the western side had collapsed into the water. One piling leaned at an angle sharp enough to make Lena wince. The cottage itself was smaller than she expected, maybe 700 square feet, with cedar shingles gone silver and 2 windows boarded from the outside. Noah whispered, "It's like a secret." "It's like a problem," Lena said, though even then she felt something else too. Not hope exactly. Recognition. As if she had stepped into a place somebody had been holding shut. The inside smelled of mildew, salt, mouse droppings, and long still air. The front room held a rusted stove, a table with one broken leg, and shelves lined with cloudy jars. 2 narrow bedrooms opened off a hall. The roof had leaked in at least 3 places. In the back, a rain barrel had split open. But one corner of the main room was dry. The windows, once unsealed, brought in light. And under the grime, there were signs that Arthur had maintained more than the family knew. A recently patched section of subfloor. A newer latch on the pantry door. A stack of split cedar under tarp outside, still usable. Not abandoned. But Lena swept for 2 hours while Noah gathered dead palmetto fronds into piles. They found an old cot frame, a working lantern, half a box of marine rope, and 3 cans of peaches expired but not bulging. By dusk, they had cleared enough floor to roll out the 2 blankets from the shelter and sit against the wall with peanut butter crackers for dinner. The temperature fell fast after sunset. Without power, the island turned black in layers. Wind hissed through marsh grass. Something scratched under the eaves. The lantern flame flickered and made the corners move. Noah leaned into her side. "Are we staying? For tonight? For real?" She hesitated. Then she said, "For as long as we need to." He was quiet for a while. Then, "Grandpa Arthur said the tide always tells the truth." Lena looked at the lantern. "Did he?" "Yeah." Noah drew his knees up. "He said people lie. Paper lies. Maps can lie. But the tide tells the truth if you watch long enough." Lena closed her eyes. The key was still in her pocket. She had tried it in the front door, the pantry, the old desk drawer, and the rusty lockbox under the cot. Nothing. Somewhere on that island, it belonged. But the first days did not feel like mystery. They felt like survival. Every task cost more than it should. Fresh water had to be ferried in by jug from the mainland because the split rain barrel was useless and the tap pipe under the sink coughed only brown air. Groceries had to be carried in 2 trips up the damaged dock. At the discount store, Lena stood with a calculator app and a basket that held exactly what $27.08 could buy: rice, dry beans, oatmeal, peanut butter, a loaf of wheat bread, a bag of apples on markdown, generic cough medicine, 2 cans of tuna, candles, and a blue tarp large enough to cover the worst leak. Milk had to go back. Cheese too. At night she boiled water on a camp stove Tomas loaned her and used a plastic basin for washing. The cold found every crack in the cottage. It came through the window frames, under the door, up through the floorboards. Salt stiffened the blankets. Her hands split at the knuckles from hauling rope and scrubbing mold. Noah tried not to complain, which somehow hurt more. On Monday she enrolled him in school using Grey Glass Island as the address. The clerk blinked twice but accepted it after checking the parcel records. The bus, of course, did not go to Islands. So Lena woke at 4:50 every morning, lit the lantern, warmed oatmeal, and got them to the skiff by first light. She crossed the inlet in darkness with a headlamp while Noah sat wrapped in a blanket and watched for markers. Then she tied up at the public landing, walked him 6 blocks to school, and spent the day chasing whatever work she could find before making the trip again at dusk. Housekeeping at a motel on weekends. Crab shed on Tuesdays. Dishwashing at the diner whenever somebody called out sick. $11 an hour here. 40 cash there. Tips if tourists were kind. Nothing if they weren't. By the end of the first week, she knew exactly what survival cost in gallons, minutes, and pain. Fuel for the skiff, $18 every 3 days if she was careful. Propane canister, $8.99. Laundromat, $6 per load. A child's inhaler refill after insurance, $32 she did not have. And hanging over all of it, the county tax deadline. 28 days to accept. 90 days before collection actions escalated. The numbers sat in her head like a hammer. The whispers started on day 6. People at the landing noticed the island life vest, the bundles, the tired boy with marsh mud on his sneakers. One mother pulling an SUV door shut glanced at Noah and then at Lena and said, not quite softly enough, "That's not suitable." At the grocery store, Aunt Bonnie saw them buying dented cans and said, "You really should let Vernon help. Pride doesn't feed children." Lena smiled without heat. Neither does family gossip. Bonnie's mouth tightened. He's only trying to keep you from making a bigger mistake. There it was again. Not sympathy. Urgency. Conrad Pike entered the story on the 10th day. Lena had heard his name before the will, the way people in a small coastal county hear the names of men who buy too much. Pike was a developer with slick silver hair, boat shoes that never seemed to get wet, and a habit of talking about bringing value to places that somehow ended with locals unable to afford living there. He had built luxury homes on marsh frontage, a wedding venue where a public fishing path used to run, and a private dock system that everybody swore violated something even if nobody could prove what. He approached Lena at the landing just after sunrise while Noah was adjusting his backpack straps. "Ms. Hart," he said, smiling as if they had been introduced somewhere pleasant. "I'm sorry for your loss. Arthur and I had discussions over the years about Grey Glass." Lena kept one hand on the skiff rope. "Did you?" "We never reached an agreement, unfortunately. I understand you inherited the property. If you'd be open to a clean sale, I can make it easy. Fast closing. Cash." Noah looked up at her. Lena asked the same question she had asked Vernon. "Why does everybody want a worthless island?" Pike's smile did not move. "Contiguity," he said. "Future access. Long-term planning. Nothing mysterious." "How much?" $25,000. Her heart stumbled, because $25,000 was more money than she had seen in one place in years. It would pay off debts, rent a decent apartment, buy Noah a bed that wasn't damp, give her breathing room no poor parent ever fully gets. Pike saw that flicker in her eyes and stepped closer. "You could stop struggling tomorrow." But then Noah said, very quietly, "Mom, that's the man Grandpa Arthur yelled at." Pike's gaze dropped to the boy. Just for a moment, the polished charm thinned. Lena straightened. "Then I'm definitely not selling today." Pike's expression returned to smooth professionalism, but his voice cooled by a degree. Take your time. These opportunities don't last. He left her with a business card thick as cardboard. On the back, in blue ink, he had written a number. 30,000. But he made a mistake. He offered too much, too fast, to a woman who had spent her whole adult life learning the value of things other people overlooked. Used furniture. Marked down produce. Quiet men who meant what they said. Children's drawings taped above broken tables. One rusted key. $30,000 for 7 acres of marsh and rot made no sense. Which meant the island was not what they said it was. The second week nearly broke her anyway. A front rolled through on a Thursday night with sleet in the rain and gusts over 40 miles an hour. The tarp tore loose around midnight with a crack like a gunshot. Water came down through the ceiling above the main room in cold sheets. Lena shoved the cot aside, dragged buckets under the leaks, and climbed onto a chair to nail plastic over the broken window while the lantern swung and Noah stood barefoot under a blanket, eyes huge and frightened. By morning, half the room smelled like wet wood and defeat. She still had to take him to school. Her jeans never fully dried that day. At the motel, a woman in an expensive robe complained there were streaks on her mirror and asked if these people were really all the manager could hire. Lena smiled and said, "I'll fix it." Then she went into the service closet, shut the door, and pressed both palms to the metal shelves until the shaking stopped. That evening Noah coughed all through the crossing home. By midnight he had a fever of 101.8. Lena sat beside him on the floor mattress, counting breaths, hearing the wheeze beneath the cough, and feeling every bad memory from the pneumonia winter come back at once. The island walls creaked. Rain tapped the roof. Her phone battery sat at 9% because the landing outlet she sometimes used had been occupied all afternoon. She whispered, "Please don't do this tonight." At 2:13 a.m. his breathing tightened enough to stop being maybe. She wrapped him in 2 blankets, carried him through mud to the skiff, and pushed off into black water under a sky with no moon. The motor choked twice before starting. Wind slapped spray over the bow. Every marker light looked farther away than it should. Noah's head burned against her shoulder. She kept saying, "Stay with me, baby. Stay with me." By the time they reached the mainland clinic, her hands were so numb she could barely tie the rope. Bronchitis, the doctor said. Not pneumonia yet. Steroids, rest, fluids, close watch. At the pharmacy, the total came to $46.13. Lena had 32. She stood there in wet shoes while the line behind her shifted and sighed. Then Tomas, who had come in for blood pressure pills, stepped up beside her and put 2 20s on the counter without a word. Outside, under the weak fluorescent hum of the awning, Lena broke. Not pretty crying. Not one tear sliding down a brave face. She bent over with the medicine bag against her chest and sobbed like every swallowed humiliation of the past year had finally found a door. Noah stood by the truck tire in his borrowed coat, watching her with the scared patience children learn too young. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm so sorry." He touched her sleeve. "For what?" "For all of this." Noah looked toward the dark inlet where gray glass waited somewhere beyond the cold. "Maybe it's not all bad," he whispered. Lena laughed once through tears because children can say impossible things and somehow not sound foolish. That night, after he fell asleep with the first dose of medicine in him, Lena sat at the table with the brass key, Arthur's note, Pike's card, and the tax notice. She spread them in a row. A poor woman making a decision with almost nothing left always knows the true weight of choice. Sell, and she could relieve the immediate pain. Stay, and she might lose everything slower. She turned the key over in the lantern light. It was old brass, heavy, with a notched oval bow worn smooth by decades of fingers. On the stem near the teeth, barely visible under tarnish, were 2 tiny stamped letters. Geej, gray glass heart? Grandfather heart? Something else. Then she remembered one more thing Arthur had once said when Noah asked why he never threw away bent nails. Because old pieces still fit old locks. She stood up. The next morning, instead of going straight to work after school drop-off, Lena returned to the island and searched. Not wildly. Methodically. Every drawer. Every hinge. Every floorboard with mismatched nails. every trunk, every cabinet. She checked the desk, the stove compartment, the crawlspace hatch, even the rusted toolbox under the porch. The key fit nothing. On the third day of searching, Noah, fever down, energy returning, found a carved compass rose under the kitchen table where water damage had warped the wood. At the center of the rose was a tiny notch shaped almost like the key's bow. "Mom." She knelt beside him. The carving was old and careful, hidden where no casual eye would see it. Around the edge, faint as ghosts, were scratched numbers. 3 to 11 and 311 North? Lena said. No. Noah touched the floorboards, thinking. Maybe steps. From where? The table had likely been moved 100 times over the years. The room itself had been patched, repainted, rearranged. Still, she stood with the key in hand and looked north. The north wall of the cottage held a narrow bookshelf, empty except for one cracked-tied almanac from 1994 and a ceramic pelican missing its beak. 3 steps from the table to the shelf. 11 inches? 11 boards? She crouched and began counting floorboards from the base of the wall. On the 11th board, the grain changed. Not much. Just enough. Her pulse rose. The board had been cut narrower than the others and reset with newer nails, then rubbed with grime to blend. Lena fetched the pry bar from outside. The first lift did nothing. The second groaned. On the third, the board came up with a long dry sigh, and stale air breathed out from the gap beneath. Noah whispered, "Mum." Below the floor was not dirt. It was a metal box fitted flush between joists, painted once in navy enamel and then forgotten. Rectangular. About the size of a briefcase. At one end was a brass lock, green with age. The key slid in. For a second it stuck. Then it turned. The click it made was small. But in that freezing cottage it sounded like a door opening between 2 lives. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and cedar shavings, lay 6 items. A leather ledger swollen with age but intact. A tin tube capped in wax. A cassette tape in a plastic case. A folded packet of notarized documents bound in twine. A black and white photograph of Arthur standing on the island dock beside a younger man Lena didn't know. And an envelope addressed, in Arthur's hand, to the one who stayed. Lena stared so long Noah finally said, "Are you going to read it?" Her fingers shook as she opened the envelope. The paper inside was yellow, the handwriting steadier than in the note from the will. "Lena, if this reaches you, I was right about 2 things. First, they came looking the minute they thought I was weak. Second, you were the one who never came looking for what was mine. You came looking for me. The island is not what Vernon says. It is not what Pike says either. There are 3 truths in that box. One is about land. One is about water. One is about what men will do when they think poor people will fold. Do not trust any offer until you verify the 1989 correction and the submerged boundary language. Do not hand these papers to Vernon. If Pike is still around, watch him. If Noah is with you, tell him he remembered the tide better than most grown men. What the tide takes, it sometimes returns." Arthur Lena read it twice. Then a third time. The wind rattled the shutters. Noah shifted closer, his shoulder touching hers. For a moment, the ruined cottage felt less like shelter and more like a message waiting decades to be opened by the right hands. She untied the packet of documents first. The top page was a survey correction filed after Hurricane Hugo in 1989, signed by a marine boundary specialist and a county clerk whose name Lena dimly recognized from older records. The correction described shoreline movement, marker displacement, and an adjusted line of ownership extending not only across the visible island but into a protected channel edge and a crescent of submerged bottomland on the eastern side. The second document was stranger. A drafted but unsigned purchase proposal from the Coastal Heritage Conservancy dated 11 months before Arthur's death. It offered a substantial payment for a permanent conservation easement if title and submerged rights could be confirmed. The reason was listed in technical language: freshwater lens integrity, nesting habitat, shoreline protection value, and restoration priority. Lena did not fully understand the terms. But she understood numbers. $2,400,000. Her breath caught so hard it hurt. Is it money? Noah whispered. Maybe. She looked again. Maybe not yet. The ledger came next. Arthur's handwriting filled it year by year. Weather notes, expenses, repairs, visits, and then in later entries, names. Vernon. Conrad Pike. A surveyor named Dennis Choate. Dates. Dollar figures. Short lines of anger written with increasing pressure. Offered again. Said island worthless to county, valuable to marina privately. Vernon brought Pike without asking. They think I don't know about shifted markers. Choate paid to simplify records. Will not sell. There were also map sketches tucked between pages, cross-sections of channels, notes about freshwater seep locations after heavy rain, and repeated references to the true line on the east shelf. Then the tin tube. Inside were plats and photographs, some of them aerial, some taken from the dock. In 3 images, Lena could clearly see survey stakes and orange flags that did not appear on any public county image she'd ever found. On the back of one photo, Arthur had written, Pike men moved marker. I moved it back. Photographed 5:41 a.m. The cassette tape was older than Noah had ever seen. They had nothing to play it on. Yet holding it made Lena's skin prickle. And then there was the black and white photograph. Arthur, younger, harder, standing beside a man in a Coast Survey jacket on the gray glass dock. Both men were holding a measuring rod. On the back, with Elias Grant after the East Channel correction. There it was again. Correction. Not rumor. Not family story. Not desperation. Proof. Noah was staring at the conservation proposal now. Mom, he said slowly, if this place was worthless, why would somebody pay that much to protect it? Lena looked at him, at the leaking roof, at the cracked lantern chimney, at the floor they had almost frozen on. Because, she said, and the words tasted strange in her mouth, they lied. That should have been the answer. It wasn't. Because hidden under the survey correction, tucked into the back of the ledger, was one final page. It was a letter from a biologist with the Coastal Heritage Conservancy thanking Arthur for refusing prior offers from development interests and confirming that Gray Glass Island sat over one of the rare stable freshwater lenses left in that section of coast, a natural underground reserve that fed marsh edges and supported the rookery habitat around it. If the wrong people dredged the channel or overbuilt the shoreline, the lens could collapse from salt intrusion. In plain language, the island was not only valuable, it was vulnerable. Arthur had not hidden treasure. He had hidden proof. And suddenly Lena understood why Vernon had wanted it cheap, why Pike had smiled too smoothly, why Arthur had kept going out there alone long after his hands shook and his knees failed. They thought the island was a grave. It was a seed. In a moment, you'll see why that changed everything. Finding papers is not the same as owning what they prove. Poor people know that too. A document in your hand can still be worthless if the world decides not to read it. So Lena did the hardest thing there is after hope returns. She waited long enough to verify it. The next morning she sealed the documents in plastic freezer bags, put them inside Noah's old-school lunch cooler, and caught the first bus to Charleston with the folder pressed to her chest the whole ride. Noah missed school that day. He did not complain. He watched bridge spans and ship cranes roll past the window and asked exactly one question every 20 minutes. What if it's fake? Lena told the truth every time. I don't know. The lawyer Ms. Delaney had recommended a specialist in coastal title disputes, a woman named Anika Shah whose office sat on the second floor of a brick building that smelled like copier toner and old wood polish. Her waiting room held framed plats instead of paintings. She wore navy, spoke quickly, and had the sharp attention of someone who had no interest in wasting sympathy where evidence would do better. At first, Anika looked skeptical. By the time she had read Arthur's letter, the 1989 correction, and the Conservancy proposal, skepticism had turned into stillness. Where did you get these? Hidden on the island. Have these been shown to anyone else? No, Anika leaned back. That was wise. Lena swallowed. Are they real? The lawyer did not answer right away. She stood, took the survey correction to the window, held it at an angle, then reached for a magnifier from her desk drawer. She examined the seal impression, the notary mark, the clerk's signature. She flipped to the conservation draft, checked dates, then opened a county records database on her computer and began searching. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Then 42. The office heater clicked softly. Noah swung his legs and stared at a model lighthouse on the bookshelf. Lena's mouth had gone dry enough to hurt. Finally, Anika looked up. These are real enough to become dangerous. Lena's heart slammed once. What does that mean? It means the correction appears valid, though I need certified copies. It means the county parcel abstraction may not reflect the full submerged rights attachment. It means if Pike or your uncle knew this and attempted to acquire the property by misrepresenting its value, they exposed themselves. And it means that conservation offer, if still active or renewable, changes your entire negotiating position. Lena felt the room tilt. So the island is worth potentially far more than you were told. But don't jump ahead. We verify everything. Quietly. That last word mattered. Quietly. Anika sent Noah to the receptionist for crackers and then lowered her voice. I've seen versions of this before. Marsh property gets undermapped, especially after storms. Wealthy buyers bet on confusion. They tell struggling owners the land is uninsurable, unusable, unsellable. Then once title issues are cleaned up, they make 10 times their money. If Arthur kept this hidden, he likely didn't trust anybody around him. He didn't. Anika's gaze sharpened. Do you trust your uncle? No. Good. Because if he senses we found something, he will move. That's when everything became a race. Over the next 11 days, Anika's office pulled archived plats, probate attachments, and clerk records from 3 different storage systems. A licensed coastal surveyor compared Arthur's private correction maps with title benchmark data. The Conservancy confirmed Arthur had indeed been in discussions with them, but had refused to finalize anything while he believed hostile interests were circling. A hydrologist's prior field memo verified the freshwater lens under gray glass was unusually resilient and ecologically significant. And buried in an old permitting file related to one of Conrad Pike's adjacent marina expansions was an internal note questioning whether his access assumptions depended on unresolved easterly channel ownership. Unresolved. That was lawyer language for trouble. But it still might not have been enough. Anika warned Lena every day not to celebrate. The correction had to survive scrutiny. The county might resist. Pike would fight. Vernon could petition the estate again. Any missing link in chain of title could cut the whole thing in half. Lena returned to the island each night with her nerves stretched so tight she could hear her own pulse in the quiet. Noah sensed everything. One night over canned soup he asked, "If it's real, are we rich?" Lena stared into the steam. Rich enough not to be scared all the time would be nice. He thought about that, then nodded in a way no child should have needed to understand. Meanwhile, the pressure from outside sharpened. Vernon came to the landing on a Tuesday and stood too close while Lena tied the skiff. "I heard you were in Charleston," he said. "Who told you that?" "In this county?" He smiled thinly. "Everybody." Lena kept her hands moving on the rope. "Maybe I wanted a day trip." "You can stop pretending. You're drowning out there." He glanced at Noah. "And dragging the boy with you." Something hot flashed through Lena, but she kept her voice level. "Say what you came to say." Vernon pulled an envelope from his coat. 40,000. She laughed once, unable not to. A week ago it was 5. "I'm trying to help you before tax foreclosure eats the whole thing." "Then let it eat it." His face hardened. "You think that old man loved you? He used you. Left you a burden because he knew you were too sentimental to say no." Lena stepped closer. "No. He left me the one thing you couldn't trick him out of." For a moment Vernon's polished mask cracked, and the bitterness underneath looked ancient. "You have no idea what that island cost this family. Then maybe you should have visited him before he died." He grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to cross a line. Tomas, who had been unloading bait tubs 20 yards away, shouted, "Take your hand off her." Vernon let go immediately and stepped back into civility like a man putting on a jacket. "You're making a mistake, Lena." She stared at him. "No," she said. "You made one." He left, but not defeated. Not yet. 3 days later, the first real confirmation arrived. Anika called at 6:14 p.m. while Lena and Noah were repairing the west porch step with salvaged boards. Her voice was clipped, almost breathless. "We have the certified correction. We have the chain. And the submerged rights language holds." Lena sat down hard on the porch. "What does that mean?" "It means gray glass includes the Eastern Channel Shelf exactly as Arthur believed. Pike's adjacent development assumptions were wrong unless he acquired your interest. Also, the Conservancy has agreed to reopen negotiations immediately. Their preliminary valuation, subject to final environmental confirmation, is now $2.8 million for a permanent easement and stewardship package." The marsh wind disappeared. The entire island seemed to hold still. Noah was watching her face. "Mom." She tried to speak and could not. Anika continued, softer now. "Lena, do you hear me?" "Yes. You were right not to sell." Tears hit before sound did. Not because of the number, not really. Though the number was impossible and life-changing and larger than the sum of every unpaid bill that had stalked her for years. It was because for the first time in a very long time, reality had moved in her favor instead of against her. Not pity. Not charity. Not rescue bought by humiliation. She covered the phone and looked at Noah. "It's real," she whispered. His eyes widened. "The island? The island." He dropped the hammer and threw both arms around her so hard the phone nearly fell into the marsh grass. Lena held him and laughed through tears while the porch boards groaned beneath them and gulls wheeled over the channel like somebody had finally opened a locked window in the sky. What the tide takes, it sometimes returns. But the story was not over. Because men who build their lives on control do not surrender quietly when the poor stop being easy. Conrad Pike moved first. A week after Anika's call, before final easement papers were signed, a barge appeared off the eastern shelf with 2 workboats and a crew laying marker buoys near the channel. Lena saw them from the cottage window just after dawn, orange vests, diesel rumble, metal clanging over the water, and felt cold go through her so fast it was almost clarity. She called Anika. "Take pictures," the lawyer said immediately. "Do not approach alone. I'm filing for emergency injunctive relief." But Pike had already bet on intimidation. By noon, he arrived in person on a polished center console boat, loafers immaculate, smile absent. Vernon was with him. That told Lena everything. Pike stepped onto what remained of the dock as if he owned the boards under his feet. "We are conducting lawful pre-development assessments," he said. Lena stood on shore with Noah behind her and Arthur's old binoculars in her hand. "On my property." "That is disputed." "Not anymore." Pike's jaw twitched. Vernon folded his arms. "Lena, don't make this uglier than it needs to be. You can still walk away with money." Lena raised the binoculars and clicked photos with her phone through the lenses because she did not own a proper zoom camera. "You told me it was worthless." No answer. She said it again, louder. "You told me it was worthless." Pike took 2 steps forward. "Ms. Hart, you are in over your head. Do you know what legal fees alone can do? 1 bad storm, 1 environmental review delay, 1 title challenge. Then why are you here?" Silence. Noah's voice came small but clear from behind her. "Because he wants what Grandpa Arthur protected." Pike looked at the boy, and whatever restraint he had left turned brittle. "This is adult business." Lena straightened to her full height, poor woman's boots in mud, hair whipped by salt wind, hands raw from work that never ended. "No," she said. "This is theft with nicer shoes." That line would later make its way through the whole county. But in that moment, what mattered was the next sound, the distant chop of another boat engine approaching fast. Anika arrived with a deputy sheriff and a man from the Department of Natural Resources carrying a folder thick with maps. She stepped off the boat without waiting for help, coat flaring in the wind. "Mr. Pike," she called, "you are hereby notified that any entry, staking, dredging, or survey activity on or adjacent to the eastern gray glass shelf is subject to immediate restraining action pending court review. We also intend to challenge the validity of your prior permit representations." Pike went pale in a way expensive men rarely do in public. "This is outrageous." Anika held up a document. No. What's outrageous is filing access assumptions through waters you did not own. The DNR officer added, and if those buoys correspond to unauthorized disturbance near protected habitat, we have separate issues. Vernon tried to recover first. This is a misunderstanding. Anika turned to him. You attempted to induce my client to transfer the property while omitting material information about known valuation and title disputes. If you would like to continue speaking, I suggest you do so through counsel. Vernon shut his mouth. Pike looked at Lena then, not as a struggling single mother, not as a temporary obstacle, but as the person who now stood between him and whatever deal he had been planning for years. He said quietly, "You should have sold." Lena met his gaze. "You should have told the truth." He thought money could finish the story. He hadn't counted on records. Or patience. Or a poor woman who had already survived the worst kind of fear and therefore could not be bought as cheaply as he assumed. The court hearing took place 18 days later in a room colder than it needed to be, with fluorescent lights, hard benches, and the kind of procedural language that can hide a war inside paperwork. Pike's attorneys argued ambiguity, erosion, historical confusion, good faith planning assumptions. Vernon's lawyer tried to suggest Arthur had been paranoid in his final years, that the hidden documents proved instability rather than caution. Then Anika introduced the certified correction, the archived correspondence, the survey overlay, and finally Arthur's ledger with corroborating dates tied to Pike's permit timeline. Line by line, the story that powerful people had told about Grey Glass Island began to collapse. Worthless was not true. Unclear was not true. Innocent mistake was not true. The judge, a woman with steel gray hair and no taste for theatrics, asked Pike's counsel one devastating question. If your client genuinely believed the property had no material strategic value, why did he make escalating private cash offers to an indigent heir within days of probate? Nobody answered well. The deputy clerk's typing sounded very loud after that. Interim injunctive relief was granted. Pike's activities were restrained. Further review of prior permitting representations was ordered. Vernon's challenge to the will failed. Costs were reserved. The conservancy negotiations could proceed. It was not a movie ending where handcuffs appear instantly and villains confess. It was better. It was realistic, which meant it